All right, everything is a story. You are a story. I am a story. Everybody has a story, and we are hardwired biologically for story. Inside each of us is a natural born storyteller waiting to be released. Story is built into the architecture of our brain, and that's what I want to talk about. There's no one way to tell a story. The same principles apply to a two-word story, a single image, a video, or 1,000-word screenplay. Story is story regardless of the format. To be a story, you have to have conflict. Conflict has two layers. Internal, I remember I went to a parochial school and the priest said, there's an angel on one side and a devil on the other side, and that's internal, and that's your conflict. I could never figure out who was where. But anyhow, there's also external conflict. This is when you run away from the lion, any danger outside, external. Now, there's some of the different categories of conflicts are man versus society, as you have today in the Gaza Strip in Tel Aviv, and you have man versus nature, as you have down in the tornadoes down in the southeast. And you remember the movie Titanic, if you saw that, the conflict there was that you could see the water rising all the way through the first half of the movie. Man versus man is another conflict. And that, if you saw the movie Gladiator, that's an old movie, but for you young people, the Hunger Games, where Katniss has to fight for her life. Or a boxing match, professional, Mike Tyson versus Lennox Lewis or the Klitschko brothers. But the most formidable conflict in a story is man versus self. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. Now, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, there were several internal moral conflicts. The title of my speech tonight is Sandra. Now, that's a story in itself. And I put it there with her permission, of course, but we're talking about Sandra, who is a master storyteller. Yes, our own Toastmaster, Sandra Gravett. Now, I wish to analyze biological effects of Sandra's speech last week. She gave her 18th speech, and she was talking about her 17th speech, which she was not happy with. And she admitted, she said she would do a self-evaluation. Now, this is nothing more than true introspection. It's a self-analysis. She said she would like to share tips with us. Well, she got our attention when she said that. And she said she learned three things: to practice, or rehearse, so that she wouldn't be rattled when she gave her speech. And she said she forgot three things: the fluorescent light bulb, the dead battery, and the shredded paper. Now, who could have forgotten that? She learned to set limits. She said, make 4 main points and don't make a whole bunch of points because you can't remember them and it doesn't matter anyhow and they get confused. So make 4 main little vignettes and be very specific. She felt she lost contact with her fellow Toastmasters. Now, metaphorically, she gave in a little joke on herself. She said, don't wear reading glasses, because she admitted it was kind of fuzzy, and she couldn't connect with the audience. So let's break this down. What we already know about her story. There's one person, the protagonist, and that is Sandra, and she is our avatar in the story. So we want her to solve her own problem. We are rooting for her. She has perceived conflict. She wants to improve her presentations. Now that spurs us on to the internal conflict that she has, and that is the misbelief, which is the core conflict, the way I see it, and she thinks she is not worthy of telling a proper story. But she is. We know she is. So we observe this conflict within her. This leads to the aha moment of the story. This is when she solves her own problem. And of course, we want her to solve her own problem, and that would give us delight. So here's my analysis of her speech as it affects us, the audience, biologically. I will tell you what I think I was feeling emotionally and what you possibly were feeling as well. Now let's look at the speech biologically. Here are three interwoven elements that by activating these in the person of the audience, she can transport us into her real story. And that's what she did. Sandra uses surprise, conflict, and vulnerability to carry her story. Biologically, the chemical stimulants are dopamine, which is a curiosity element, cortisol, which is the stress element, and oxytocin, which is the empathy element. Story element number one, surprise. Sandra expects one thing in her 17th speech. She thought when she reached level 5 of Toastmaster of pathways, that she would just be elated. Well, she wasn't. In fact, she was unsatisfied, she said. So in her and us, biologically, the dopamine started emitting in our brain. And this dopamine is the curiosity transmitter. So all of a sudden now we're wondering, okay, so what is she going to do about this? Story element number two is a conflict itself. Sandra has no choice but to make a hard decision. She said she's going to do that speech over again and tell us. Now here she is self-disclosing. She's going to tell us what she did wrong. Now nobody ever gives speeches like that unless it's one-on-one, but Sandra does. So this sets up the conflict. And what kind of a biological reaction do we have? We have cortisol. This is the stress hormone, and it surges. And this allows the suspense to mount in her story. Now, story element number three is vulnerability. Nobody could even challenge the fact that Sandra does not deliver vulnerability. She is the master of vulnerability. We empathize with Sandra because of it. We hope she succeeds without getting sidetracked. Our biological reaction is oxytocin. Now, this is the empathy neurotransmitter which surges in our brain, and it's making us care for her. We're on Sandra's side. We're rooting for her. We want her to be successful. We feel somewhat relieved as she tells us what her game plan is, and that is in the future, she's going to rehearse. She's going to focus on about 3 or 4 little vignettes and be very specific about those. She's going to connect with the audience. And metaphorically, she's not going to wear those reading glasses again. She's going to wear the correct glasses. Now, I watched her speech on Zoom, like all of you did, but I put it on gallery so I could see the reactions of other fellow Toastmasters to what she was saying. I could see the neurotransmitter visibly. I could see the emotion. A good example was our guest, Matt. Now, you remember Matt visited us last week, and he was excited about the speech, and he was very emotive. Every time Sandra would say something, he would react, and you could see the neurotransmitters firing off in his brain. I do believe the way Sandra presents herself is the mark of her total success. She shows respect for the audience, and the audience shows respect to her. She is able to emit an instant emotional effect on the audience. Now, I'm not sure how she does it yet, but I keep watching. I watched all of her 16 speeches before that, and I remember her first icebreaker, and that's when she introduced her forefathers and how they immigrated to the States and how the Chinese built the railroad out west. But in Sanders' speech, you might remember that 30%, you might remember 30% of what you saw and what you heard, but you will remember 90% of how she made you feel biologically. So as Sandra taught us in her 18 speeches, speak to the emotion of the audience. Now, the takeaway tonight is, remember, emotion is just as important as content.
Thank you.